Hello and welcome to another Bendigo Life, and we're joined today by George Flack. Hello, George.
Morning, Dennis. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and thanks for joining us. George, last Monday was the closing date for submissions in relation to Recommendation 8 in the Council Independent Review, and that related, for those people who don't know, and most people would have a rough idea now, it related primarily to City Futures, which is a directorate at the moment, being potentially split off into, say for example, the Capital, the Gallery and others, so that, with a view in the longer term to having each one become self-sufficient. You've done a lot of work on that, and I understand you put a submission in on Monday.
I did, Dennis, and the key focus on mine was, in accordance with Recommendation 8, it was to aspire to have, over a 5-year implementation plan, the ability to have that unit self-supporting. Now, whether each unit inside the 6 business units that they've got there becomes...
Just run through those units,
Yeah,
George,
I will.
first.
And look,
what are they? Because a lot of people would know the Gallery, they know the Capital, they perhaps know the Ullenborough now, but what are those 6 units?
Well, before we say the 6 units, let's just read out what the independent review said that they wanted to happen. Investigate the option to separate the Economic Development Unit, Tourism, Art Gallery, the Capital and Major Events from the City Futures Directorate into a separate entity. Right. This investigation must include an implementation plan which would provide strategies and direction for the entity and underlying business units to aspire to become a self-funding operation within 5 years of separation. So what that's about is, it doesn't necessarily mean each of the business units needs to be profitable, but overall the total sum of them
as a package
should be.
Yeah. And so with your assessment of this, and I don't want to get bogged down in too great a financial detail, because your average punter out there is listening to this and they're thinking, well, hang on, they're costing us how much now, and how much is George suggesting they might cost us in over the 5 years?
5 years. Well, they're costing us now $10,865,000 as of the 15-16 draft budget, and those figures have been extracted by me out of the council's figures. So
that's per year, 10 million?
That's right now for this particular next year. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean that the year after they're going to be 10,865,000. They're more likely going to be higher. Now, I've gone through and spent a considerable number of hours on looking at all of the different 6 business units, which we've said are Capital Venues and Events, Bendigo Art Gallery, Tourism Unit, the Major Events Unit, the Economic Development Unit. And from the start to the finish of those 5 years, I've worked it through and looked individually at each of those business units for both their revenue, their expenditure, and therefore it creates either a deficit or a surplus.
Yep.
And in total, it comes up at the end of those 5 years that there'll be a surplus of $317,000. Now, it might not sound like much, but that's a long way from 10.865 over 5 years. And the way it's achieved is, you know, you've got to do it over a period of time, and it doesn't happen any other way. So 5 years is a reasonable time. It's what the independent review suggested it ought to be.
So let's just look at that financial turnaround again. If I'm understanding you correctly, it's $10 million a year now that it's costing to run those units. And you're suggesting, with the changes that you have in your submission, that after 5 years, instead of having spent $50 million over those 5 years at $10 million a year, we actually end up as ratepayers with a $317,000 profit, I guess.
That's right, spot on. You're on the money, pardon the pun.
So how do you arrive at that, George? What
the way
sorts
you
of things
arrive
would
at
have to
it,
happen?
well, some of the key things are, we're underselling ourselves. I've travelled the world widely. I've been to different museums and art galleries across the world because I do have a pet for that. So you go to the Louvre in Paris and you'll spend €16, which is around about 25 Australian dollars to get in there, right? Yeah, the thing you go in there to see is a Mona Lisa or something like that, but there's everything else. This Bendigo Art Gallery has got significant displays of world-renowned artists. Why should you pay a gold coin donation of $1 or $2 to go in and see it? Now, the people that go in and see those things are not people with a hole in their pocket. They're people that are well-to-do. And we're underselling ourselves very cheaply for things that we could afford to do for value.
A lot of people, though, George, would look at it and say, potentially, let's use the Grace Kelly exhibition as an example, and people may well be prepared to pay $12 or $15 or $20 to go in and visit an exhibition like Grace Kelly. But have you differentiated between that sort of...
I have. And I have not taken into consideration unusual things like Archibalds, Grace Kellys, Kachuas, whatever else.
So you're not suggesting for a moment that Bendigo Senior take all these students through there and they pay $12 a head? Or
No.
That's not part of the plan?
No. But what it's about is the ordinary, everyday, there ought to be admission charge there. Secondly, if we look at the capital...
Did you come up with an amount there, a rough amount? You would have to arrive at...
Yeah, I have, yeah. And that progressively goes from the original said that the income generated right now is 1.295 million, and by the end of year 5, you're up to 4.7 million, so you're 4 times more. But
and again, in the interest of giving people a grasp of how this might impact locally and day to day in terms of your average punter, give us a rough idea. If a Bendigo Senior student visited that gallery as part of their school curriculum, if they visited the gallery, and it wasn't Grace Kelly, it was just today.
Just an ordinary today figure.
What sort of a figure are you talking about there for admission, to give people an idea?
Okay, round about the $15 mark for a student concession or a pensioner concession, as opposed to $25 if it's an ordinary adult person going through it.
You think people
and you'll get value for money because you'll be there for a few hours.
And can you see people accepting that sort of, like people going crook already about the costs everywhere, particularly with education? In fact, I picked up today in the press today, they're suggesting now the last 1 or 2 years of education for a child, people saying you've got a budget around the $30,000 mark.
And that's
per
true.
Student.
Yeah, so I know that from my time.
That's a hell of a cost now that you're suggesting.
What we're talking about here is, why should the ordinary ratepayer, and that's the 85 to 90% of people who don't support that area, why should they subsidise the people who do go there? And they're subsidising them by twice as much as what's coming in now.
Let's look at it another way too, George. If we accepted what you're saying and we said that over 5 years, ratepayers in the city of Greater Bendigo potentially save $50 million, having not spent that $10 million per year for 5 years, eventually making $300,000 odd at the end of the 5 years. So you've had that $50 million turnaround. What would you propose would happen with that revenue? Would that go into General Council revenue, or what would happen with that?
Well, one of the things that can happen, Dennis, is the fact that you don't have to continue to be raising your rates by the 5 or 6 million a year for a start. Secondly, that 5 million of loan money, you don't have to go and borrow the money. So you can devote those savings to capital works everywhere without the need for all of us having to put our hand in our pocket every year. And then that is really where I'm coming to. Keep it simple, stupid. There's only those couple of keys that you need to do. Over that 5 year period, Dennis, it's at 10.865 in year 1, and then it starts to reduce from year 2 down. So it doesn't become a saving of $50 million over the 5 years, it reduces. So it becomes...
as you offset the costs with the revenue.
About $21 million you end up saving over that time, because that's how you just run it down into the... It's like a seesaw.
There's your aquatic centre, or most of it anyway.
Well, that's another debate. I've had that.
We won't go there. No, we've covered that in other areas. But in terms of you having put your submission in and council, I know I attended a press conference down there recently with Craig Newman was there and the Mayor Peter Cox. And Peter Cox, and typical Peter Cox, was very vocal in terms of saying, I want open and transparent council. I want people to become involved. At the time they were releasing a strategy for comment, the budget, draft budget. And Peter Cox was very vocal in terms of saying, I want people to be engaged here and we want feedback. What sort of reaction, if any of you, had to your submission? Or is it too early yet?
It's too early yet, and where it's at the moment, Dennis, is I believe that the city officers will be looking at one really fantastic thing, and that is putting them on the council website. Now that's really this Peter Cox move for open transparency.
Gee, that's a good move.
And that's a fantastic move, and I haven't heard anybody from when I found out about it yesterday that's been against it. So that's a full mark to the council for doing that too. And
so if people wanted to see your submission...
They'll be able to see it on the website probably from the middle of next week, I believe. So it's open, and I got no issue with... That's why I produce this material, and it's open to any commentary, and as long as they stick to the ball and not the man, I'll be more than comfortable with them doing it that way, Dennis.
Finally, George, I will ask you that you've had some flack, if you pardon the pun, in the press led us to the end, and that from in particular one former local councillor and a couple of well-known high-profile identities around town, suggesting you didn't understand how council's budget process worked. Yep. But in fact, the difference between expenditure and revenue with council, if there was a surplus there, then that's what went into CapEx. Yep. How did you see that?
Well, look, I did understand it. I had this issue with the number of words you can put in your letters to the paper, and I'm a big picture man, so I just went straight for the big picture business, and that's probably a mistake on my part. But I respect, and I put that acknowledged in the paper with that particular councillor and mayor, and he's an astute businessman as well. He's come back with a letter that says, well, yes, he agrees with what that's about, and that budgets are confusing, and that's where the key is. Today's Bendigo Advertiser, Thursday the 14th, has got the reply to Alex's letter that was in there last Saturday, and it drops the bombshell on what I've proposed in my council draft budget submission that I'll lodge tomorrow, the day of the deadline, which is to consider how do we best fund going forward with zero rate rises, not borrowing $5 million, doing the no frills 50 metre heated indoor pool at Kangaroo Flat for around about the 14, maybe $17 million, but no more than that. And how do we do it? Well, there's a few things in there that can be cut the meat from the sandwich and the fat out of it. We've got 5 directors that the late John McLean, CEO, decided to implement at the end of 2005 into 2006. I've put in my budget recommendations that we could take that down 60% and have two directors. Combine 2 directors in 2 of the areas to become 1, and the 5th one is recommendation 8's already gone into have the creation of ACECON, which is the Arts, Cultural and Economic Development Consortium.
Which would be the umbrella under which you're
and that's under what this recommendation 8's about. And so City Futures goes off over there and becomes a new business unit, just like BenCon created in the 90s for their road construction works.
And again, George, for people to have a look at this, because it's always difficult in the time frame we have, that will be available on Council's website.
Well, I'm assuming, and recommendation 8 is going to be up there next week, and that'll be up there, and that's the one we've been talking about. And I would assume the budget submissions that we lodge with a deadline of tomorrow, anyone who lodges has the ability to ask Council if they could be heard. And so on Tuesday, the 26th of May, 6 o'clock, that's where that'll happen. Right. And I think we get about 10 minutes, so it's a matter of being able to physically present to them, and I'll be putting in my 2 bobs worth for that too.
George, thank you so much for giving us access to the submission you put in. And I think, look, we'd both give Peter Cox a pat on the back as mayor.
Too right,
and, to come up with this concept of, all right, well, let's get it out there in the public domain on the web, that's what it's for. So wonderful for people to be able to get a taste today for what it is that you're suggesting, but at the same time now we encourage them to go online to the council website, City of Greater Bendigo website, and have a look at your submission on the recommendation 8. And then hopefully down the track on the budget submissions as well. Thanks so much, George, for taking the time today.
Dennis. Thank you.
And we'll look forward to catching up again soon.
Sure will. Thanks, Dennis.